How many of you have heard of Transova Genetics? Almost everybody. That's one of our companies as well, located in northwest Iowa. And what about the genetically engineered mosquitoes fighting Zika? Any of you heard of that one? That's us too. So we do all things controversial. I'm not really going to talk much about what we do because I want to talk about the future of agriculture, the role of science, and how we can better communicate with the public. If you want to talk about the things our company does, happy to talk about that later. So in many ways, though, there's nothing we do that has a bigger, more negative impact on the planet than agriculture, but there's nothing more critical for our daily survival. So the challenge we all have is how to maintain and grow the benefits and reduce the negatives. So if we were to talk about water, land, 40% of all the land on Earth that could be used for agriculture is already being used for agriculture today. The amount of cropland is the size of South America, the amount of pasture land the size of Africa. So in terms of the footprint of agriculture in terms of land, there's nothing bigger. And I think we'd all agree it shouldn't be any bigger. If anything, we want to reduce that. If we were to talk about water, this is the Aral Sea back in 1973, and if you fast forward to today, it's no longer a sea at all, and that's largely because of agricultural withdrawals of water. Now, these aren't just the challenges of 2050, they're the realities of today, and they're not just things that are happening in other places. Here's the Colorado River, the 6th largest river in America, no longer flows to the sea. And again, largely because of agricultural withdrawals. So these are important challenges today. If we were to talk about climate change, 10 to 15% of greenhouse gases come from agriculture, another 10 to 15% from deforestation, 80% of which is caused by agriculture. That's almost as much as energy. It's more than anything else. But for every dollar you invest in wind and solar, you get less than $1 back because they're less efficient than fossil fuels. Now, those are important long-term investments for our future. But for every dollar you invest in agriculture, you get $1.43 back everywhere in the world. Positive rates of return. So you have to wonder, would consumers rather pay more for their energy or less for their food to get a cleaner environment? And from what I know of Americans, they'd rather eat their way to a cleaner environment. I can say that because I don't work for the government anymore. So how do we talk about it? Because 90% of the conversations about energy policy, almost nothing about ag policy, and certainly not about the benefits and opportunity of agriculture. Now, you know we're going from about 7.5 to 9.5 billion people by 2050, and that's obviously a challenge. But we also have 800 million people who will go to bed hungry today, and that's also a challenge. Now, there are about 9 million people who die every year of hunger, but that's such a big number that people have trouble wrapping their minds around it. That's 25,000 people will die today of hunger. That's 1,000 people in the next hour. That's one person every 4 seconds, mostly children. How do we get the public to understand that these are not statistics, these are human lives? That's one of the things that we need to do. Now, when people look at 800 million people going to bed hungry, they feel like our food system is failing us. They think that things are getting worse. On the other hand, 800 million people represents about 12% of the global population. And if we went back just 30 years, 24% of the world population was living in hunger. If we went back 50 years, 36% of the global population was living in hunger. When you use today as the baseline, it seems like things are bad and getting worse. But once you look at the past and you start with 1950 or 1980, things are good and getting better. The question is, are they getting better fast enough? Now, you know that we need between 60 and 100% more food by 2050, but we need to do it using less land, less water, and fewer resources. So we have to do everything better tomorrow than we're doing it today, and our rivers and lakes are running dry. But one of the big challenges is not just how we produce the food, but it's these competing views of how our food should be produced. On one hand, we have people that are saying that we should be producing our food the way it was produced 100 years ago. There's a slow food movement. And there's also a movement towards more intensification of agriculture. And these are two important global trends, and we need to find a way of bringing them together. Because if we don't, we won't be able to solve the problems that we all face. Now, I like to say that people love innovation almost as much as they despise change. And there's no place people despise change more than in the food they eat. Because food is what brings us together with friends, with family, and if you mess with my food, you're messing with my family, and people don't like that. But if we don't change how we produce food, everything will change. So we need to have a conversation that allows people to see these changes as innovative and not changes for the worse. Because it's not really about good or bad or right or wrong. It's about choices and consequences. So in the next decade, Europe will increase its agricultural production by about 4%, just ahead of sub-Saharan Africa. On the other hand, Brazil will increase its production by about 40%, driven by demand in its number one export market, Europe. So Europe has taken a low productivity, low intensification approach to agriculture, and as a result, it can't feed itself. And because it can't feed itself, it has to import its animal feed needs. Europe imports 70% of its animal feed needs, and so what that really means, though, is that Europe is exporting its agricultural footprint to arguably the most biodiverse country on the planet, Brazil. And remember, 80% of that deforestation is caused by agriculture. So Europe is the single largest driver of global deforestation along with China. Choices and consequences, not right or wrong. Europe can choose to produce its food and protect its local environment, but there will be consequences to that. And if we don't talk about that, then the people in Europe believe they're making choices to protect the environment when there are, in fact, potentially negative consequences to it. Understanding choices and consequences is critical. But how food companies market products tells the consumer how that food is produced. So you look at these pictures and you see, oh, these are beautiful farms. They're idyllic as the animals are led to slaughter. And so they market a vision of reality that maybe isn't quite consistent with reality. And now this is dog food. I'm not sure that the dogs really care what the farms look like. But there's this inconsistency between marketing and reality that has a big impact on how consumers, what they think about our food system. And this is leading to skeptical consumers because they don't really understand what real agriculture looks like. Now, I used to spend a lot of time trying to talk to people about hazard and risk. So I would try to explain that from a regulator's point of view, hazard times exposure equals risk. And so I would give examples of that and try to explain it to people. The problem is that we're hardwired to understand hazards. We are not hardwired to understand risk unless we're statistician, and nobody talks to statisticians if they can avoid it. So how do we do that? Now, so I try to be clever, and so I would explain a hazard is like that shark in the ocean, and a risk is when you're swimming in that ocean. And so you don't need to worry about the hazard. You only need to worry about it when it becomes a risk. Again, it doesn't really matter. We're hardwired to understand hazards. We're not hardwired to understand risk. If something can cause cancer, that's the same as it does cause cancer as far as consumers are concerned. It's not really surprising. So what I eventually realized that I should be talking about is that hazard times media exposure equals perception of risk. And that's what most of us are dealing with on a regular basis. People worry about what they're told to worry about. How could it be any different? People don't worry about things that they're not told to worry about. Why would they? How could they? So today, somebody hears something that sounds scary and they tweet it out to their friends, hormones in beef. And this is what I call the tweetification of risk. They tweet it to their 10 friends, who tweet it to their 100 friends, who tweet it to their 10,000 friends, and it's all the way around the world before most of us have gotten out of bed. Not you guys, of course, because you're out of bed early, but me. So how do we deal with that? We have to be engaged in these conversations. And also, if you look at how these foods are marketed and how products are marketed, it's a little bit hard to see here on this, but this is water, which is no preservatives, GMO-free, gluten-free. It's vegan, thank goodness. So these are the ways that companies are marketing their products. Now, you can imagine the marketing guy when the science guy told him, he's like, our water's gluten-free too. And he's like, his mind is blown. We could own the gluten-free water market. He's like, no, that wasn't the point I was making. It was a joke. And it's like, we do have gluten in it? No, we don't, but let's do it. And this is what you get. So on the one hand, it makes perfect sense. We could own the non-GMO water, the GMO-free water market. On the other hand, what are you really telling your consumers? Because consumers, by and large, don't really care about gluten or preservatives or these issues. What they care about is the health and safety of their family. And they have come to believe that GMO-free and gluten-free and other things are associated with health and safety of their family. So you're marketing something that you know won't make them better or healthier or safer because you can. But ultimately, I think that it undermines consumer confidence in those same brands when they realize that perhaps they've been misled. Now, if you leave this room remembering one thing, it's that you should not trust your brain. Your brain is lying to you all the time, even now. Now, there's Daniel Kahneman won the Nobel Prize for some of his work on psychology, and one of the things that he talks about is that we have two parts to our brain. We have a fast-thinking part of our brain, and we have a slow-thinking part of our brain. And that fast-thinking part of our brain is sort of what gets us through our day. It's making lots of quick decisions without really bothering to think hard about it. And that slow-thinking part of our brain, well, that's what does the math. It's doing all the hard thinking and working things out, but it is lazy. It will not do the math unless it has to do the math. And so I'm going to give you some examples of why that's important. But first, I'm going to start with a visual illusion. Now, when you look at this, how many people think the square on the top looks darker? Raise your hand. Those who don't trust me, with good reason. You know where this is going. All right, so what we're going to do is we're going to pull out those circles. They look kind of similar, and now I'm going to cover it up, and you can see it's actually the same color. Now, I'm going to uncover it for a second again. The point is that our brain is trying to help us. It believes that the top square is in direct light, so it must be darker than it looks. It's color correcting. And it believes that the bottom square is in shadow, so it must be lighter than it appears. So it's trying to fix the picture so that we can perceive it accurately, and of course it's not. It's screwing up. But what's important here is it doesn't matter how much you know the colors are the same. You can't see them as the same. Knowing something and perceiving it are not necessarily the same thing. So other ways that this plays out. Now I'm going to give you a math problem. Any fifth grader can get it right. Only 80% of you will get it wrong. Don't worry, the smarter you are, the more likely you are to get it wrong. When I say the problem, I want you just to shout out the answer. Okay, this is called the bat and the ball problem. So a bat and a ball together cost $1.10. The bat cost $1 more than the ball. How much does the ball cost? Answer? I'm sorry. The bat. So let's do it again. A bat and a ball together cost $1.10. The bat cost $1 more than the ball. The ball cost? All right, I'm still hearing 5 and 10 cents. Now we have to do the math because we got two different answers. So if the ball cost 10 cents and the bat cost $1 more, then it would cost $1.10. So $1.10 plus 10 cents is 1.20. 5 cents plus $1 more would be $1.05. So the answer is 5 cents. But most of us, if not all of us, initially thought 10 cents. And if we had stopped there, you would have left thinking, what an idiot. That was the simplest math problem I've ever done since 5th grade. And a lot of us would have been wrong. But if we stop and do the math, of course, we can all get it right. So the point is that we go through our day, every day, making decisions like that we are 100% sure are right, and we have not bothered to do the math, and we're wrong. It's not just consumers, it's us, it's everybody. So we need to understand the kinds of mistakes and fallacies that we make in order to understand how other people come to decisions that we may disagree with. So confirmation bias is just this idea that we look for information that's consistent with our beliefs and we avoid information that's not. So I like to give an example of my own bias at work. So if I were to read an article that said, organic agriculture is more nutritious than conventional agriculture, what would I do? I'd ask, who are the authors, who funded the research, and what was their methodology? All perfectly reasonable things to do. But now let's say that the article said organic, no more nutritious than conventional. What am I going to do? I'm going to tweet it, right? Because it's consistent with what I believe. So bias is not ignoring things that are obviously wrong. It's asking tough questions, digging deeper, searching until you find that one little thing that allows you to ignore the rest of the information. Aha, that researcher worked on an organic farm when he was in college. Boom, he's biased. Or maybe I'm biased. So understand our own biases, though, helps us to be able to talk to other people about theirs. Now, another psychology principle is something called the availability heuristic. It's just what things come to mind when I say a word. So now when I say the word natural, are you guys thinking butterflies, rainbows, salmonella, Ebola, Zika? Because all the bad things are natural too, right? But we all think happy thoughts when you hear the word natural. Do you want a natural apple or an unnatural apple? You know, it makes perfect sense, even though we know all of the bad things are natural too. We all have a bias in favor of natural things. Nothing we can do about that. So we shouldn't be shocked when people have this bias. We need to understand it. Now, one of the challenges, though, we have is that consumers have never cared more nor known less how their food is produced. And because they care, they're asking for policy changes based on that. But because they know so little, those changes may not help them to achieve their goals. They care more and they know less. What's interesting is if you ask people from rural communities, how much do you know about food production? They'll say, not so much. And then you ask people from cities, how much do you think you know about food production? Yeah, I know a fair amount. That might not be accurate. So people don't even know what they don't know, and that's dangerous because it has implications for all of us. Now, this is not my daughter, but it could be. She's not the most adventurous eater in the world. So how can we talk about food, though, in a way that engages people and excites them and that doesn't turn them off? So I want to give some examples. How many people in the room have eaten a Chinese gooseberry? Please raise your hand. That's not too bad. I hope that the kiwi fruit will eventually make its way to Des Moines, though. It's quite good. Names matter, right? How we talk about things matters. Because when it's a Chinese gooseberry, it's a hairy fruit. But when it's a kiwi, it is cute and fuzzy, right? So think about the story. Back in 1910, some intrepid Kiwi went to China, found the Chinese gooseberry, brought it back to New Zealand, and, most importantly, rebranded it. And the rest is history. How we talk about things matters. The language we use is critical to how people respond to us. Now, you may have heard this idea, if you can't pronounce it, you shouldn't put it in your mouth. And, you know, those of us who like science, you know, like to beat people up to explain just how stupid that idea is. You know, we go after those people who say that. You know, so you can do that. You can beat people up with science, or you can just show them the ingredients in a kiwi fruit or a banana or an egg, and they realize all food is made of chemicals, and they laugh, and they just get it. So you can either beat them up with science or you can lead people to knowledge. People actually like to learn. They watch TED Talks and they seek out information when they feel like they're learning something, when it's knowledge. But when people are trying to tell them something, people just close off. And so we need to find that way of getting information to people in a way that they're ready to receive it. Now, sometimes people ask me, what's the scariest food you know? And I always say, the seedless watermelon. Unless I'm speaking to the seedless watermelon people, then I use a different example. This unfortunately happened to me one time. I was, like a month ago, I was speaking to the National Restaurant Association, and so I'm using this example. And then I look up and I see the sponsor, and it's the National Watermelon Association. Little damage control there. So that was not as much fun. Those guys can be vicious. All right. So the thing is, though, I was wondering, where do they come from? They don't have any seeds. You know, it kind of blows your mind. So I did some research on the internet, so I'm pretty sure it's true. You start with a watermelon, and it has 2 sets of chromosomes. You expose it to colchicine, which is a natural plant extract, which is highly toxic and mutagenic. I added the skull and crossbones, so you'll be more concerned. It still produces 4 sets of chromosomes, and it still produces seeds. So then you cross that back with the original watermelon, you end up with a watermelon with 3 sets of chromosomes, which is so screwed up, it will not produce seeds. And that's the one you eat. No nutritional evaluation, no food safety evaluation, because this is conventional agriculture. Now, I'm not trying to convince you to stop eating your seedless watermelons, but people are like, 3 sets of chromosomes, I didn't know it had any. Next thing you're going to tell me is it has DNA in there. Like people are shocked. But the point is that nobody's telling you to worry about seedless watermelons. Nobody is saying produced with mutagens, produced with toxins. If they were, we would probably be a little bit nervous, but they're not. We worry about the things people tell us to worry about. But you can talk about things in a way that actually entertains and engages people, and we need to do more of that. Now, when I was with the government, the things that we often talked about would be research shows it's safe, we're going to feed the world, better for the environment, keeping prices low. Research tells us these are all things that turn the public off. Unfortunately, if you lead with science, you will lose with science. Science, at the beginning of a conversation, only polarizes the audience. Those who agree with you more, and those who disagree more. It's pretty depressing for those of us who like science and like to talk about it. So we all need to ultimately become better storytellers. Whether we're farmers or scientists or policymakers, we all need to do a better job. And one way that we do it is that we need to be able to personalize our stories. And it's perhaps easiest of all for farmers and ranchers to do that because you have such a great story to tell. But we often get right into the science and right into the debate and right into the discussion without stopping to explain to people where we come from. And we need to be willing to acknowledge people's concerns. In 13 years at the State Department, I never met a single person who was anti-science. I met a lot of people who didn't trust the government, who didn't trust big business, but they all love science. The problem is that when science and values are inconsistent, values always win. So it's not that people don't like science, they just care about their family more. And whenever you say, if you don't like GMOs, you're anti-science, that's like saying you're an idiot, but let's talk. And it just doesn't work as well as you might imagine. So if we, though, talk about the challenges and what we're trying to achieve, we can begin to connect with people and demonstrate that we share these same values. And if we do that, we can build trust. And it's only at the point of trust that science has anything to say about the conversation. So a few years ago, I was speaking to the American Meat Science Association. So there are 800 meat scientists in the room. It was as exciting as it sounds. And I said to them, if people don't trust you, science doesn't matter. And if people do trust you, science doesn't matter. Stop telling people what you do and tell them why you do it. If people get the why, they generally don't care about the what. So think about it this way. If somebody is you're talking to somebody and they say, GMOs are safe, and you do not trust the person, and they say, no, I have a lot of research that shows they're safe. You don't need to see their research if you don't trust them. On the other hand, if there's a scientist and you do trust them, and they say GMOs are safe, I have a lot of research that says it's so, well, they still don't need to see your research because they trust you. So we need to engage with people in a way that builds this trust because it's everything. Now, some of the thoughts I want to leave you with. If we went back to 1969, a lot of the conversation would be about population growth and the challenges that faces. And the population bomb had just come out, and it predicted that within a decade, 1 billion people were going to die of hunger. Now, of course, that 1 billion people didn't die, and that's because Norman Borlaug and the Green Revolution were already well underway. And by 1970, Norman Borlaug would win the Nobel Peace Prize. And it was because of better health and nutrition that those 1 billion people didn't die. But also, people continue to worry about that population growth. But if we went back to 1950, the average woman had 5 children. Today, it's only about 2.5, and if we look out just a few more years, it's only going to be at replacement rate. So the challenge isn't that population is going to keep growing and growing forever, because it's actually incredibly low. The rate of population growth, how fast population is growing, peaked in 1966, the year I was born, and it's been declining ever since. So now you may wonder, if population isn't growing faster, how can we go from 7.5 to 9.5 billion people by 2050? And that's entirely because people are living longer. 100% of that population growth is because of people living longer. It is a good news story. But it's also the reason that after 2050, population growth slows dramatically. And so the challenge that we face is not to produce more and more food forever. The challenge that we face is to get to 2050 without cutting down our forest and without draining our rivers, lakes, and aquifers. Because if we do, in many ways, we're good forever. All of the productivity gains that happen after 2050 will go to reducing the amount of water use, reducing eutrophication of waterways, reducing the impact on forests. Everything gets easier after 2050. That's our opportunity. But it all requires that we get there without screwing things up. So the thought I want to leave you with is the next 30 years are not just the most important 30 years there have ever been in the history of agriculture. And they are. They're the most important 30 years there will ever be in the history of agriculture. And that's why we need to get it right. And that's why the work you're doing is so important. But in order for us to get there, in order for us to be able to apply the technologies and the science and the practices that will save the planet, people have to trust us to use those technologies. So science tells us what we can do. The public tells us what we should do. So we need to be able to earn the public's trust in order to be able to help them to save the planet. Thank you.